shows their
Okay,
face. So.
okay. Well, the PhD began really as a consequence of our discussions in the IMT, which we're all familiar with, the conflict about the class nature of China was central to discussions which we had in 2006 to 2010, when a significant number of us were expelled or left the tendency. And since that time, I think the evidence has pointed overwhelmingly in favor of the arguments that we made at the time. And I wanted to try to properly investigate, short of the fact that I can't speak Chinese or read Chinese, but properly investigate using the information available worldwide on the character of China, its system, how it's organized, how it functions. And when I was doing that, I began from the same type of direction which we had started out in the IMT, and that was from an analysis of the methods used by Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, the Soviet opposition economist in the 1920s, who during the Soviet industrialization debate tried to work out a method by which the accumulation of state capital, which he considered to be socialist capital, could be organized to maintain the revolution and to accumulate from small scale businesses, medium scale enterprises, and foreign trade. And so within the context of participation in the world market and the permission of capitalist enterprises to operate, whether petty or large scale, Preobrazhensky tried to work out a formula or a methodology by which a socialist economy could develop, having overthrown capitalism in a relatively backward country. And you could, of course, apply the whole conceptual framework to the process of global revolutionary change towards socialism. So it wouldn't have to be applicable to an individual country, but is a global process. And obviously the individual country question touches on the issues which Trotsky and so on raise. But within the context of this isolated Soviet economy, which was compelled to retreat from its initial attack, if you like, or assault on capital, assuming that the revolution would spread elsewhere, it was compelled to retreat and adopt the new economic policy. In new economic policy, the dominant sectors of the economy, in other words, the largest industries, infrastructure, transportation, mining, banking, and so on, dominated the economy and accumulated resources from the private sector by multiple methods. And there was no formula worked out. This was an approach to how the general shift towards, and I'd prefer to use the word rather than primitive accumulation, which was relating to Marx's theory of the development of capitalism from feudalism. Instead of this, to use the word original accumulation. It's a translation question, but it has some significance, because if you use the word original accumulation, you're actually more accurately defining the process, rather than primitive, which obviously has a negative connotation to it and was associated with the origin of capitalism. So that was the one approach, was to attempt to apply or attempt to look at how Preobrazhensky's theory could be applied to assess the dynamics in China. The second element to it was to look at another theory, and that's a very mainstream theory, in fact, probably the most mainstream theory of socialism, which meant, and it was worked out by a guy called János Kornai, who's a Hungarian economist. He was a supporter of, or a Marxist, if you like, in his young days, and he became an economist in Hungary after the Second World War, and attempted to make the thing work. Now, there are many people inside the bureaucracies in these countries who attempted to make the system work. They were believers in socialism. who attempted to work out ways to grow the economy and to improve the living standards of the people and so on within the parameters of their thinking. Now, and in the parameters of the state system. Now, Kornai, unlike Trotsky, had the advantage of analyzing the dynamics of the, and I'm going to use the word socialist for this, and I'll explain what I mean by that, why I'm doing that. The analysis of the socialist systems which existed in those states. He defines the planned economies, the bureaucratically controlled economies, as socialism. Now, obviously, this is, I actually made a mistake in the final draft. I didn't put in a little footnote when I first put the word socialism. I did actually have it in all previous drafts, but in the final draft, I didn't. And I just left it as, well, this is his view of socialism. But it allows us to understand the nature of the systems which emerged in the Soviet Union and also after the Second World War. They had some fundamental dynamics in common. And I believe those fundamental dynamics can be used and were best analyzed by Kornai and can be used to assess and analyze the system in China today and how it developed after 1978. It's slightly different, but it's not fundamentally different. Now, his methodology was based on the critique of socialism, which developed by Hayek and von Mises and these people who criticize socialism, arguing that socialism is basically an idea that can't function because it can't organize the pricing system correctly. And if bureaucratic prices are imposed, then all sorts of distortions happen in the economy. And these distortions, if you like, inevitably, according to their theory, lead to the collapse of the system. Now, the pricing system that they refer to is actually almost identical to the theory of the law of value, which Marx worked out himself. And they were also, Kornai is also considers himself deeply influenced by and guided by the theoretical framework, the fundamental theoretical framework worked out by Marx. He calls it a systems theory. And I think it's a valid framework for assessing society. So systems theory, he means that you can compare social systems in a pure form and then look at the differentiation between that pure form and the reality. And that method was also used by Marx and was used by Preobrazhensky. For Preobrazhensky, he was looking at the contrast between capitalism and socialism and the transition between the two. For Kornai, he was looking at the Stalinist system as it emerged, comparing it with capitalism, and then because in the end he concluded that socialism is inevitably doomed and that 1989, if you like, showed that, he drew the conclusion that that was the end of it and therefore you couldn't possibly accept the idea that anything was socialist thereafter. And then he had to amend his theory because China maintained a Communist Party in power and all the structures that we know today. And I had some correspondence with him on this, and he was actually, to be fair, he was one of these, or he is one of these old East European intellectuals who actually did engage with me on the discussions. And he was quite taken aback when I sent him a critique of his analysis of China and showed him that his own analysis of socialism, or better called reform socialism, was a better method to understand China than his theory that China had become some kind of corrupt gangster capitalism wherein the rulers are just using the words of socialism, don't believe a word of it, and have just accumulated billions and are just hiding behind this red cloak. So this, he accepted that there was a serious question mark over this, at least in his initial discussions with me. Thereafter, he sort of lost contact because I think he just found it too irritating, and he's kind of old and so on. So that's the background to the two theoretical frameworks that I've tried to apply. And I think each of them reveals an element of, or fundamental elements about the way the system functions. Trotsky's theory did not deal, as I repeat, did not deal with the states which emerged after the Second World War, and attempts to do so, for example, by our own comrades, tended to be rather weak in their capacity for analysis of the reforms taking place. Basically, we always argued in the tendency in the past that any reforms would be basically a cycle of centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization, inevitably either ending in the re-centralization towards the worst forms of Stalinism, totalitarian, authoritarian Stalinism, or towards political revolution. And I think that was, well, it was obviously flawed because some of them went towards capitalism, but it also underestimated the internal dynamism inside, well, I'll take that back, not the internal dynamism, the internal dynamics of these systems that led to the reform process. And the reform process, I believe, the biggest flaw in Kornai's analysis is it's his own viewpoint, because he's pro-capitalist, so he says it inevitably ends up in capitalism. But actually, because his analysis is honest, he also reveals that there is a tendency that he calls workers' self-management. Workers' self-management is generally associated with Yugoslavia, but he makes it a broader question about the way in which the systems in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, and so on, inevitably give rise to workers' demands that pressure the bureaucracy and that force them to carry out reforms in the interest of the workers that maintain some stability. And there's a constant, if you like, battleground going on inside workplaces, inside communities, and even inside the party that has different characteristics to anything that you can envisage under capitalism. The reason he says this is as follows. Basically, his analysis of bureaucracy, of state bureaucracy, is the core of this. And that's why I think there's an interesting element, addition, if you like, to Preobrazhensky or Trotsky's theory. And that is that a bureaucracy, let's say a university bureaucracy in Britain. A university bureaucracy in Britain, it doesn't have the profit motive as its primary driving force. Its driving force is the administration of the university, and each of the departments within the university, all of the leaders in these departments, they all seek their own self-expansion. That's the drive of the bureaucracy. It's to protect itself, expand itself, increase its influence. So, for example, Imperial College has been in the news about the whole COVID question. Imperial College, the professors there, the departments there dealing with epidemiology and, modeling and so on, they inevitably push to expand their influence and resources, and to have extra professors taken on, to increase their prestige, to develop their influence. Now, if you take the economy or the decisive sections of economy into public ownership, then this bureaucracy automatically appears as the dominant force within multiple institutions that control the society. The Communist Party will make the appointments in all these institutions, but the institutions themselves have their own internal dynamics. It's not just the party saying, do X, Y, and Z. The party can say, do X, Y, and Z, but on the ground, each bureaucracy will be pushing to get resources. And all of them, because the plan is set down centrally and say, this is the overall plan we want to do. X percentage growth, so and so many houses, so and so many schools, so and so many universities, and so on. Each of these institutions will formulate their demands within the plan. So the plan will say X, Y, and Z, and so and so many percent, so and so many houses, so and so many whatever, quality, quantity, whatever it be. And each bureaucracy will then have to formulate that plan within their own section of the economy or the institutions of the state, education, military, and so on. And so they fight each other. They fight each other for control of these resources. There are limited resources. All of them automatically request more resources than they need, because they know that the central bureaucracy will begin a discussion and negotiation, a bargaining program to work out how to amend and adjust and implement the plan at a local level and inside each different institution. So rather than a single monolithic structure controlled by Joseph Stalin or by anybody else, actually you have multiple agencies, each with their own power and spheres of influence, who themselves lean upon the workers working inside those bureaucracies and associated with those bureaucracies. They lean upon them for support. Now, if the bureaucrats controlling a department, a workplace, a big institution, or an entire bureaucracy, if the workers inside those entities have to be motivated in some way to do things, because there are a million, you can't just force everybody by whipping them and enslaving them, as the general Western theory of Stalinism proposes, that it's just a totalitarian dictatorship and everyone does everything because of fear. In fact, as these economies began to develop economically, particularly after the Second World War, the bureaucracy was no longer able to force people to do things. In any case, that's a very inefficient mechanism. You have to have some consent, participation, and belief in the system to make it work. So that explains the energy and dynamism in the 1960s, for example, in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, and so on. Friends of mine told me, anecdotal, but friends of mine told me, after the Berlin Wall was built, there was a sense in Eastern Germany, for example, that they were going forward, they were making progress, and they were defeating, if you like, achieving things and developing society. Now, so each of the bureaucracies have their own interests and they clash with each other. And the central bureaucracy attempts to mediate between them. Inside the workplaces, there will be appearances, inevitably, of elements of workers' control within institutions. So what does that mean? It means that the manager, he has to go to the central bureaucracy and ask for things. The plan says you get X, 100 million something, and you put in for 110 million. The bureaucracy negotiates 103 million. And then those resources have to then be used to encourage the workers to work. So you might pay incentives to the workers and differentiation, like the Stakhanovite type movement and piecework. And on the other side, you also have to satisfy them, which means you have to build houses, schools, provide, canteens, entertainment facilities, and so on. And so the general process in the Stalinist countries was, yes, they had a central dictatorship controlled by the Communist Party, but that central dictatorship had multiple levels of diversity, reflecting this pressure between central and local, and then between the management and the workforce. And the workforce were able to exert pressure to the degree whereby managers would often be able to be removed. Often they had, for example, in China today, you have anonymous phone lines, and you can phone up anonymously and you can denounce somebody. Now, if someone was to denounce somebody in a Western capitalist company, the capitalist company just, finds out who the person is and sacks them. In a bureaucratic entity, dominating, where an economy is dominated by public ownership, that is not really possible. And so the bureaucrats often would be removed. So there was a dual pressure. You must do this, the people above might say to them, but at the same time, they have to negotiate with the workers below in order to motivate them to do anything. And so this is why Kornai's theory is important, because it does assess the nuance within the system, which none of our analysis of used by the IMT and previously the militant tendency did. It was always just one or the other, totalitarian dictator. And that's why the IMT and co have been totally incapable of understanding what's happening in China, because they've ended up saying, it's just an authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship. The worst of capitalism, the worst of Stalinism. I mean, the regime simply could not have survived were that the case. And it simply doesn't correspond with any reality. But the same frame of thinking dominates also a lot of Western thought, mainstream thought, because they constantly talk about China. You know, whenever they talk about China, they're saying suppress the information, hide it, conceal it, lie to people, totalitarian dictatorship, oppress everybody. But 95% of more than 95% of the population simply don't experience the regime in that way. And the nuance which is proposed by Khoo and I, or the better said, the understanding of what happened in these countries, assessed by Khoo and I, allows you to grasp the nuance which you can see in these countries. And that allows you to understand how the dynamics of revolutionary change can or do and will happen in these countries. So in order to assess where China stands on this framework that Khoo and I worked out, I just look at there are three central concepts. One is that rule by the Communist Party is a precondition, or better said, rule by a party that is opposed to private property, or that opposes private property in its fundamental behavior. The second is a bureaucratic or public ownership of the dominant sector of the economy. And the third is bureaucratic administration and control and coordination of the economy rather than the pricing mechanism. Now, that initially, when I first looked at that, it seemed very mechanistic framework of thinking. It is not really that mechanistic, because if you look at all these countries, it is certainly true that the patterns of behavior of countries that had or have those frameworks, those three props in place, are almost always the same. The move from, you know, all these things that we did observe, centralization, decentralization, and so on, all these processes, but also the internal conflict, as I said, the workers and the management. This is a fundamental framework from which to understand the system. So I also looked at the working class and the role of the bureaucracy in relation to the working class, and the way in which these dynamics towards what's called workers' self-management, or workers asserting their position of influence and power, manifest themselves. On the one side, when the Stalinist system, if you like, the most extreme Stalinist system, if you like the prison-style Stalinist system, which is itself also a manifestation of bureaucratic power, because the bureaucracy, seeking to perfect itself and its methods of control, automatically wants as large a scale as possible, as tight an observation of the processes as possible, and a force of a development speed as rapid as possible, so that they can contain and satisfy the wants of the people, because that way they reinforce their power and realize their objectives. So within that framework, the Stalinists or the regime in China has, since the reform era began, accumulated resources from the private sector, developed the economy extremely rapidly, and because of that, simultaneously developed the biggest working class in world history. Now, that working class operates, a section of it, the smaller section of it, operates within the planned sector of the economy, or the publicly owned sector of the economy, perhaps 20% of the workforce, 10 to 20% of the workforce, and the rest of it works in one way or another in the private sector, whether in cooperatives or in pure private companies. But at the same time, because the central plan drives the development of the economy and the public sector drives the development of the economy, around this centrally organized structure is drawn the private sector operations like iron filings to a magnet. And so the driving force of development creates a gigantic working class, which itself then is able to exert pressure to prevent the restoration of capitalism, because the pressure they exert is towards improvement in living standards, better conditions, and so on. And lower layers of the bureaucracy, closer towards the working class, involved in the process of urbanization, still commanding the population in some way, but commanding it, if you like, through plans, through development perspectives, and through a negotiation or conflict between workers' demands when they emerge, when they explode, and the bureaucratic machinery which controls or administers the society, which is manifest in every workplace and every city, township, and so on. And so the development of the working class is an objective process on the one side, and on the other side, a subjective process. The subjective process is about these simmering forms of discontent which emerge, and then the pressure they exert on the bureaucracy that compels the upper levels to respond rapidly to, if you like, to clip the wings of the nascent capitalist class. And of course, the similar process was developing inside the Soviet Union in the 1920s. When this whole conflict, Trotsky said, you know, capitalism or workers' control. This was the idea they had in the 1920s, just before the 5-year plan was introduced and a third period began. And basically, they didn't take, I mean, Trotsky at that time didn't take adequate account of the way in which the bureaucracy could rule over the people for a long, long period of time. He predicted that, you know, some people say, well, when he was talking at that time, that his was one or the other, you know, capitalism or socialism, and if the bureaucracy maintained its power, then inevitably come back to the same question, capitalism or socialism, right, in the impending future. So he wrote in one piece, I remember, about the end of the Second World War. Well, if the Second World War doesn't create socialism, then, you know, the socialist idea is doomed, the working class is incapable of taking power. Actually, the process has revealed that, if you like, a dual world began to develop. One section of the world following the planned economy, but with these peculiarities that it could vacillate between a sort of North Korea and China, or between Maoism in the, if you like, in the 1970s or late 70s and Deng Xiaoping's regime. So when people say Deng Xiaoping was a neoliberal and so on, I think this is nonsensical. He always had the perspective of maintaining the dominance of the public sector. Now, you might say, well, that was a sham, you know, they didn't really mean it and so on. I mean, there's an argument about that. But again, this is about pressures. What pressures were exerted within society, what drove the bureaucracy to behave in a particular way, and what drives it today. There was a guy I spoke to, he was at King's College as well, but he teaches Marxism in Hangzhou, Zhejiang University. It's about a town of about 10 million, about an hour or half an hour from Shanghai, about 100 miles from Shanghai, half an hour on the fast train. And he's teaching Marxism. I said, how many professors of Marxism believe in Marxism? He said, maybe 5%. And then I said, how many students do you think of Marxism believe in Marxism? He said, maybe 10%. So illustrative of this process, there are many people you will meet if you encounter representatives of the Chinese bureaucracy who you would say, well, they're just pro-capitalist. They don't believe a word of Marx and Marxism and so on. But it's the social relations of the bureaucracy with the masses that compel them to behave in a certain way. And it is also ultimately these social relations rooted in public ownership that pressure the leadership of the state in order to stay in power to turn again and again, whenever a crisis comes, towards the methods of bureaucratic control and administration. And that is applicable today as much as it was in the past. I mean, I think I've given an overview. I think it'd probably be better if we discuss questions and contributions now, and if you want more details about specific things, that I come back with them. Is that right? It's been half an hour already.
Okay, okay, Heiko. You could have gone on a bit longer if you wanted, but I think it's
probably
there's going to be a lot of people have a lot of questions, and
yeah,
that's maybe the way to go. So
yeah, I think so.
Perhaps I can ask any comments. You've got questions you'd like to pose to Heiko about what he's been talking about.
Hello. Hi.
Oh, hello, Joe.
Hi,
Hi,
how are you? Hi, Heiko.
you doing all right?
Hi, yeah, I couldn't join on time because had a connection problem. But
No
yeah,
worries.
I mean, I listened to your comments and analysis, and I found that I agree with it most. I agree to your analysis, most of your analysis, and I'm just sort of adding in a little bit more. I would say, I think one thing that needs to be taken into account is agency structural analysis in China. I think it's quite important because you have, scholars would may possibly from the left would um, focus more on the structural causes of matters, and then probably towards the right, people focus more on the sort of agents, the effect of agents and the agential factors. In China, I think people will look into it as both, and this kind of dialectical relationship between agents and structure.
Do you want to explain what that means, what you mean by that?
Yeah, so individual actions, to what extent individual actions can influence the consequence, and to what extent is determined by the structure, the bureaucratic structure. So for me, I think in China is more dialectical in the sense that because relationship is very, very important in China. So this guanxi relationship, and that, I mean, it's not countering your argument. It's more adding, because it's saying that this diversity and dynamism comes from these different kinds of individuals as well as groups, and how they deal with relationships in each institution. And I think that's very important. And then obviously that brings us to this kind of state society complex. The discussion of state society complex in China is more I think it's more complicated because of this cultural emphasis on relationship and guanxi, right? So I mean the positive side of this is that each area individual, whether you're a manager or a worker or as a group, you're more responsive to policies, you're more responsive to decisions, processes and outcomes. That's the positive side, of course. And then the slightly less positive or negative side of things is image building, is face management. So as, for example, an administrator in an organization, right, its action is very much determined or influenced by its relationship with others or perceptions of others, right? And talking about it from a Marxian perspective, you might say, the leader tends to be more responsive to workers' demands, not necessarily meeting their demands, but definitely more responsive in that sense, right? Because of this kind of complex relationship. And I mean, even if we're talking about to all the way to the central government, right? I mean, one may argue about Xi Jinping, what's his character, but he also talks about this idea that reform is driven by issues raised from below and deepens continuously through resolving the issues. So a lot of Communist Party members believe that is so it's not like they do not want issues to occur. They welcome issues to occur, because once issues occurred, it gives them guidelines to resolve or to come up with new policies. And in this way, it pushes for a reciprocal mechanism that functions for the interests of the party, of course, but also for the majority as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but I think there's something that needs to be highlighted though within China, and this you can also animate the discussion by talk about this idea of federalism, but it's a de facto federal setup, right? The local and the central. Okay, that's it from me.
Thanks, Joe. Feel free to come back later on as well. Maybe we'll take a few more questions before we ask Heiko to come back. Any other comrade would like to come up with a question? Paniotis, go for it, Pan. Paniotis, is your mic?
Yeah, I have one edit. Hi, many thanks for excellent exposition. My remarks, my comments are more towards the economic side of things. What I would like more is if you could give us some of the characteristics of, let's call it, the economic model followed in China during the last 3-4 decades, and which, of course, through different phases, and which seemingly has been very successful. Does it currently face strong bottlenecks and dilemmas and factors which cannot lead to the continuation of this kind of economic expansion that we have seen? And in this context, and in relation to the recent events, I would like to mention a couple of references. The first one is by Alfredo Saad-Philo, which you probably know, Heiko. He is at King's College now. And in a recent analysis of COVID-19, neoliberalism, and so on, he did mention China in a sort of positive way, that countries with strong manufacturing base and planning abilities and so on have managed to fare better both regarding the health issue and the economic planning issue. And another reference, which is, I think, a very important contribution by Mike Davis, and I found it in the Progressive International website, where he talks about the real bottlenecks, and I think, yeah, many others follow this line as well, that China's model is facing. Although it was China who made a strong contribution in 2007-8 to bring the world economy out of the crisis, this is unlikely to happen now because China has devoted so many resources on infrastructure development, internal development of the economy. So much construction has taken place, and this has involved keeping wages low, keeping consumption low, and also China has developed this infrastructural approach, investment approach abroad, internationally, through this Silk Road or investments in Africa and so on. So there are contradictions, strong contradictions in the Chinese model, apart from the political aspects that you have mentioned, also regarding the economic aspects. And although I'm not one who would dismiss what's happening in China in terms of the balance which it tries to keep between the public and the private sector, workers' demands, and so on, I think it has made strides regarding the developmental approach, but has that come to a real bottleneck? What is your opinion? And some comments on what you think the characteristics of the economic side of China are. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Panagiotis. Great.
Back on them.
Okay, perhaps you take one more comrade, and then after then I go to come back on that. Any other comrade like to come in? Maybe one of the comrades who have to leave. I don't know if Manzur is still with us. He may have had to go already.
Yeah, he's there. I see him now.
Manzur, maybe you would like to ask a question before you go, or comment?
Thank you. Very good, Heiko's introduction about the China. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you great.
Oh, okay, okay. So I visited 2-3 times China, and is there? We read in the very initial stages that socialism is internationalism or nothing. What is the role of Chinese state or Chinese bureaucracy in international movement of the socialism? Number one. Number two, as Comrade asked earlier, so China is giving loans to the other countries like IMF and World Bank on very high rates. So what is the international role of the China? And number three, one more question. So I saw the even the townships and different villages and different peripheries of the cities. Still, there is a difference of standard of living in the peripheries and in the big cities. So, do you think that Chinese bureaucracy is still fighting to bridge up that standard of living, and how they can?
Okay. I mean, the central.
Okay, Heiko, come back on. Yeah, come back on.
Yeah, the central focus of the Chinese Communist Party is to maintain power by improving the living standards of the masses. The methods they use to improve the living standards of the masses fluctuate between and zigzag a bit between private and state, and they have conflicts within the bureaucracy and between the capitalist sections and the capitalists themselves and the bureaucracy and the working class. So you've got different pressures at play. We were discussing the other day with Michael Roberts and it was about, oh, they're going to open the capital account. And a lot of people remember when the World Trade Organization, when they signed up to World Trade Organization, a lot of leftists said, this is the end of socialism in inverted commas. China's joined the World Trade Organization. China is capitalist because of that. And there were people who protested and demonstrated and screamed and shouted about this because on paper, the foundations for capitalism were laid by those type of processes. On paper, the opening of the capital account, in other words, the allowing of the influx of private capital, the operation of private banks, foreign banks, and so on, would undermine the plan. But the first question I asked him when Michael said this was, what mechanisms do they have to overturn this? So if they allow the capital account to be open, can they stop it? He said, yeah, they can stop it straight away. Well, I said, well, that's the issue. As long as they can reverse the policy, they will go with almost any policy. Anything they think will work, will make something, will make some money. And don't forget, this is such a vast country that the complexity of real life on the ground is almost infinite. For the potential to set up businesses, to operate, engage in swindles and tricks and so on. There's all sorts of ways in which people can try and make money, from legitimate to totally illegitimate. And so you have these contradictory dynamics, but the essential question is, can they maintain power? Can they develop the economy, which is a precondition for that? And perhaps more importantly, can they maintain the living standards of the masses and improve them? I'll come back to the international question a little bit later on. Coming back to the question of Panagiotis, which touches on this question, is there a bottleneck? Is there like something coming up which is going to stop them from doing this? Well, there is the global economic crisis which is coming, and they didn't want to do too much of a stimulus program, but they've guaranteed that they will improve living standards, which is the main. Next year is the anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, the 100th anniversary. And this is one of their targets, a reasonable standard of living for the masses by that time. And in all the key issues, they've been able to achieve this. And living standards have improved massively. It's not just the 5-year plan, but there are plans which are, if you like, even longer term plans. The long-term plan was 2021, the 100th anniversary, the 200th they got, 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, and then the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic in 2049. And these are the two benchmark, if you like, overriding plans of the party. Then you've got, I think it was called the 300s plan or something like that, which was to do with urbanization. So again, as the method for achieving these long-term objectives, which go beyond the 5-year plans, the urbanization plan is central to this. And the urbanization plan basically has meant the moving of hundreds of millions of people into the cities and their, if you like, incorporation within urban legal framework. So it's like if you move from when the European Union, or when we were part of the European Union in Britain, you could move from one country to another, and you had some rights in Britain. If you came from Poland or Lithuania, you could work here and you had the same rights as workers here in general. And in China, that was not the case until recent years for large numbers of migrant workers. They were sort of almost like under apartheid. You come from, you have one regulation for the black people, another regulation for the white people. Well, if you were rural and you'd been born in a rural area and you moved to the urban area, your residence status meant you could not get the same rights and conditions as the workers in the urban area. Now that was seen, to some degree justifiably, as a sort of smashing the iron rice bowl, destroying the rights of the workers, and creating a sort of 2-tier layer of the population. And then this would, like, if you like, establish an unbreakable power for private capitalism through low wages. In fact, what happened is wages rose right throughout the whole period. And even now, wages rose decade on decade, year on year throughout this period. And the workers became even more powerful, despite the fact that there are hundreds of millions of migrant workers, and despite the fact that, for example, after the Great Recession, there were some 20 million workers laid off. So unemployment in China does not mean, again, that's an illustration of the theory that China is not a capitalist country, is that unemployment does not mean reduced wages in China. High unemployment, spikes in unemployment caused by cyclical motions, both of the marketplace and of the bureaucracy itself. It's got its own dynamics, expansion, the expansion overreaches, because every section of the bureaucracy is fighting to get resources. There is a limit to those resources. And so some projects fall by the wayside, and some projects get more resources depending on which ministry is powerful and which social pressure groups are putting pressure on the bureaucracy. And one of the central things to the removal of the hukou registration, not completely removed, but the removal of a lot of hukou registrations, so where you were born, removal of a lot of them in the urban areas, in the lower level cities and the major cities, has also led to major improvements in the living standards of the masses. It's like suddenly you can get welfare rights, you can get social security, get guaranteed employment, you stay on for 3 years, you get a permanent work contract. And so all these factors have, if you like, strengthened the position of the working class and improved their living standards. Consumption has consistently risen in China, contrary to what, unfortunately, it's often the case that leftists analyzing China, they start out with the perspective China is capitalist, so they don't have an open mind about the question. It is a closed question for them. And then once they've got this closed question, all they're looking for is every disaster that can happen in China. And of course, in a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people, you're always going to find some slavery, some monstrous exploitation here, some factory that, you know, where the walls collapse on the workers and so on. But in general, living standards have consistently risen. Now, can they continue to consistently rise in circumstances where the global marketplace is contracting? Well, they're going to focus, they will attempt now to focus on the internal economy. And because it is true that investment has been the main focus and consumption less of a focus, they can reorientate that export market economy, which, for example, in 2010, it was still the case that if you wandered around Beijing, and I thought, well, 2010, you can wander around Beijing, you can pick up some bargains that are for sale in the West, cheaper than for sale in China, cheaper in China than you would get in the West, you know, things they're exporting, you know, some clothes or whatever. So I wandered around Beijing for a couple of days looking for no bargains. It wasn't cheap to buy things in China that you could buy externally. So now if they reorientate a lot of these manufacturing processes towards the internal market, they will, in my opinion, be able to overcome the crisis caused by COVID-19 internally in China and across the world, because there's a lot of scope for improving living standards in China. Healthcare, and the healthcare is a big issue. Healthcare, pensions, welfare rights, all these things can be improved significantly in China. There's a Professor Dick Lowe at SOAS who's got a very similar view to my own view and to the view of Jonathan and so on. We've been discussing with him recently. He compares it, he's a bit more neutral on the class character, but he compares it to, if you like, the golden years in the West. So the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is where China is at now. It's in a period of long-term economic expansion and improvement in the living standards of the masses, provided, of course, that the capitalist forces don't gain the upper hand. But there's no indication that they will gain the upper hand, not because people in the upper leadership of the bureaucracy or surrounding the upper leadership bureaucracy wouldn't be amenable to such a thing. It's because the social pressures in society and from the bureaucracies that dominate the society will be pressing, particularly now, the healthcare and education sector and pension sector and urbanization sector. All these bureaucracy will be enormously powerful now as a consequence of what has happened with COVID-19. So, yeah, I don't think there will be any major limitations, major bottlenecks. I mean, there are bottlenecks on Belt and Road, but Belt and Road it's like a mass of different projects utilizing resources on a global scale. But if 50% of them work, they will be absolutely fine. That's my guess about it. In relation to the external trade relations, there's someone called Sam Key. She's been working on the same questions with us and discussing with us for some time. She's done a study, perhaps I can send it to those who are interested, of China's relations to Africa, and found that in nearly all the cases, and it's not just her who's done this, but nearly all the cases of alleged super exploitation by the Chinese of African resources, they've been shown to be inaccurate or false. In general, the trade relations between China and Africa have been relatively equal relations. That doesn't mean all the agreements they make are beneficial to the people of the country, but they tend to be designed for an exchange which is beneficial to the Chinese development of the economy and that uses, for example, the road building capacities developed in China to build roads in Africa at low cost and a high quality. And so overall, China's influence around the world will grow because of this, because every so-called developing country needs to satisfy the wants of the masses in some way and to develop the infrastructure. And China is the main agent for doing that, whether it be in Venezuela or South America or Africa or, you know, large parts of the world which have not got the basic infrastructure. China has developed skills in that which are unmatched anywhere else in the world. And so, you know, they can undercut them and still, and they'll take things that you otherwise, you know, they'll take exchange, barter exchange. They'll make agreements like Cuba and Venezuela did. They make agreements, you know, we'll build schools, hospitals, roads, you give us copper, you know, and it's not a bad deal. You know, it's not a lot of these mines, for example, in the Congo, there's a big mine copper mine they developed, and there's a big hoo-ha in the West about it. But actually the copper mine was just sitting there. You know, the resources were just sitting there. Nothing was done with them. The Chinese developed it, and at the same time provided infrastructure, roads, and so on. As regards the internal relations between people in China, what allows the system to function, what allows them to bypass bureaucratic hurdles. It's quite often said that this thing called guanxi, or networks, or relations between people, is something very special and specific. You could argue that. I mean, it's a very common thing amongst scholars of China to talk about this unique characteristic of China's dealing mechanisms, how they approach each other, deal with each other. But to be honest with you, there was something called blatt in the Soviet Union, which basically meant you had to grease someone's hands. And the bureaucracy also didn't, it's the very nature of bureaucracy itself that they don't like to lose face and authority. So if you challenge them directly, they will act against you. But if you find some way to, you know, smooth the road to them, then, you know, you may be able to get your way, or maybe able to negotiate some agreement. I don't think that is all that different as far as the influence on the development of the economy and society than in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But yes, there are historical features of China which are different, but I don't think they're all that different. And actually, if you look at those countries that survived, there is a characteristic which is common. Those countries that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were all countries that had prolonged guerrilla warfare before the revolution. In the case of China, the Communist Party itself was forged out of the civil war in China, a 22-year civil war, by the way, in which the party wandered from place to place, assembling forces, gathering, you know, come into a town or a township or a village or a, you know, a city. And when they conquered that town, they just assembled together those people who they thought were influential. If they needed to move against the landlords, they did. If they wanted to make a deal with the landlords, they made a deal with the landlords. Even sometimes they made a deal with the Kuomintang, even the Japanese at various times, and dealers and so on, and with triad gangs. And so they were, because they had an army, and the army was powerful, and they'd entered the city or the township or the village or the area, they established their own hierarchy of power, which was the same hierarchy of power which was fighting the war, but was flexible and could move around and take over one area, leave that area, take another area. That's the way the Communist Party was founded in China, or better said, developed in China over the 22-year genesis from 1927 until 1949. And so the characteristics of the Communist Party, in my opinion, are primarily founded by that. And it's the same in Vietnam, Laos, actually, and Cuba. All these countries came out of civil war, out of an armed struggle. So there is a slight, that I think is influential and perhaps more decisive for determining the character of these regimes than the peculiarities of the networks, the national networks which connect people together. Yeah, I think I've covered most. Oh, international socialism. Sorry, one final point on one source. I mean, they're not advocating international socialism. They believe in peaceful coexistence and the competition between systems. But and even that, they don't even know that. They're not even sure about that. But on the other side, the internal dynamics, because China has developed to such a powerful economic position, it has also, as a consequence of that, expanded its influence around the world, and therefore led people to question whether or not, or what elements of the system in China could be developed in other countries. And therefore sort of intellectuals, lower level bureaucrats, just the same as in Syria and in Ethiopia and so on, where layers of the state bureaucracy, and Libya seized power on the back of some sort of coup d'etat, for example, and then began to implement a planned economy. So too, I think other countries around the world will come under these same pressures, particularly now after this economic or during this economic collapse in the next few years. I think there may well be pressure in some countries where upheavals take place, military rebellions take place, and so on, to institute something quite similar to the Chinese structure. And if they establish the dominance of a bureaucracy, then that's the reason why I was talking the way I was talking, and the method I've been trying to use for this. Then there will be an automatic process of self-expansion of that bureaucratic power if the old regime, if the old private relations are broken between state power and capitalism. If that is broken, and in some countries the capitalists are very weak, then you can have the institution of a planned economy. I mean, that was almost what happened, or better said, perhaps it has happened in Venezuela, despite the attempts of the leadership, and despite, if you like, having a formally a bourgeois democratic regime, still they were compelled to assert the dominance of the plan. Unfortunately, they did it in such a chaotic way that it's caused disaster. But at the same time, the dynamics, the internal pressures that cause that are there. And so there could be states that emulate China, not because they intended to in the beginning, but because the dynamics inside many countries are so catastrophic that they will give rise to these type of rebellions.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Heiko, because we're working on this Socialist Manifesto, which this whole series of talks is part of the process.
Yeah.
And we're obviously taking into account the experience of China in drawing up that manifesto. I think one of the interesting things that the Chinese have done is that they've, by kind of carrying out the new economic policy in Russia to its logical conclusion. And I'd be interested, by the way, if you could mention about how you think that policy, that NEP policy, and the theorists who supported it, how that actually did influence Deng and the Communist Party leadership's reform and opening up. But I think that one of the things that China's demonstrated is that their form of market socialism, as they describe themselves as, that it actually has delivered incredible results economically, and that by allowing their publicly owned industries, companies, a full freedom to work and trade and so on, and having to have them compete in a market situation with relative free price movements and so on, how that has actually forced those industries to become much more effective and much more efficient. And the question about, incidentally, a question about the world market and what's happening with the world economic downturn that's coming now. What a lot of people don't realize is that China's penetration of the world market is still relatively small, if you measure it. And once when you go into a crisis, then and you don't have any, you have very little income, your tendency is to buy cheaper and to perhaps ignore brands or not treat them as the key factor. And so you might actually see a lot more people buying Chinese products, especially if the Chinese products, the quality of Chinese products are rising. So anyway, I think that the experience of China is having an influence on our the way we're beginning to look at developing this manifesto. Not that we can sort of slavishly copy the set up in China, but I think it's got some important lessons for the ideas we can put forward in the future, and of course the ideas for how China itself can develop. That's another all-important question, which we're going to have a whole session on that later on in this process about the future of China. So I won't get into that now. Okay.
Can I come in?
Yeah. I know, Yen, you have to go early, so why don't you come in? Yeah, definitely go for it.
Yeah, I mean I do. I mean, based on this presentation and then my previous knowledge, of China. I do appreciate and understand totally Heiko analysis. It's very, very objective, which is very, very good. And of course, China has done a lot for their people, which is extremely great. But coming from, let's say, a country like Ghana, I'd like to know whether the Communist Party has some element of internationalism in their policies and plans. The other thing is that the absence of, I'm not talking about the Chinese state, or maybe we could even say the Chinese state, but our experiences in Ghana has been, even though Heiko did talk about somebody's analysis, and I'm not denying the fact that most of the terms, the trade terms between China and African countries, are much more better, fairer than Western trade terms. But the problem is that the presentation, the Chinese who are, and I'll take Ghana for example, and I have been involved in the struggle. I come from the upper east of Ghana in a town called Balgatanga. That region has got a lot of gold, and there is this Chinese company called Sanjay, Shanii, that is mining gold there, and then they came in, and I'm not blaming the company, because of course they came in through Ghanaians, so the Ghanaians made the class, or whoever introduced them to the mining, and then they came in, and then they are mining there. It's been terrible. 1 year alone, about 16 people, 16 young people below the age of 25 died in their mines. The health and safety is extremely zero. They don't pay taxes. Of course, it's done with the connivance of the local elites. And the Chinese, even people have done books on it. And if people want, I can look at some British intellectuals have done some work on this particular mine, and it is available online. And what is happening is that quite a lot of people, it's creating a lot of dissatisfaction. They don't pay taxes. A lot of young people are dying, and there is such an intense, at present, there's such an intense struggle in China, and I say in Ghana, in the region, and some element of anti-Chinese feeling. Apart from that, Ghana is a country that has gold, and you've got a lot of the machines that have come to dig the. In Ghana, it's called galamsey. Galamsey means people who just go into the forest, they dig. One of the regions is called Western region. One of our regions in Ghana, at present, they hardly get water to drink. And a lot of I have to make it very clear that they do, the Chinese companies or the Chinese individual, and there are a lot of Chinese individuals involved in galamsey. They do it with the connivance of the local elite, but because they are Chinese, everybody sees them as the people who are involved. So there's some element of anti-Chinese feeling in Ghana. Currently, they went, and then the government needs a lot of money. So there is a place called Kibi in Ghana, which is a forest reservoir area with a lot of water, and the water, that area provides water for 5 million people. The Ghana government, of course, went into an agreement with the Chinese state to mine the bauxite. And environmental groups, everybody is saying that, listen, if you mine this bauxite, you are going to deprive the capital of 5 million people, 5 to 7 million people are not going to get water to drink, and that is going on. But like I say, it is done, and I don't blame the Chinese, it's done with the full connivance of our state, But what I also find out meeting individual Chinese, because I'm in Bulgaria, they come around and others. And what Heiko said, I now understand why when you meet a Chinese and ask them about Mao, they don't even know who Mao is. And some of them are very anti-Mao. I thought that at least every Chinese will know Chairman Mao, but a lot of Chinese you meet in Ghana, you say, who is, they're very, very anti-Mao. There is a situation, is when the Chinese came into Ghana, they were interested in donkey. You know, you all know what donkey is. They were interested in the donkey skin. So they'll go to the villages, buy, of course, maybe with the connivance of some elements, buy donkeys and just slaughter the donkeys, take away the skin, and then leave the meat. But in the past 2 years, they set up a factory in Wale Wale, a town in northern Ghana, where they now bring the donkey, they kill it, and they take everything, including the meat, exporting it. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, I do appreciate the extent, of work that the Chinese Communist Party has done. I do understand the balancing act, the bureaucracy, and Heiko has put it very well, because because if you don't, you can't just be a dictator, you can't just be a Stalinist. You must have some element of support. So internally, one can appreciate the policies. But to me, despite the fact that their policies are good, there have been some elements like in Ghana where they are involved, and you can Google it, quite a number of the population sometimes have to go to some an extent, fight to such an extent that some Chinese have been deported. And we know that most of Galamsey, when the local people are doing, it's not that dangerous, because they can only, let's say that Sanjay, this company I'm talking about, when local people are digging the mine, just in a year they may dig some few acres, but in a day Sanjay may dig, and they are not declaring the profits. So this is an amount of, there is a growing struggle against Chinese companies in Ghana, yeah. And then coupled with a struggle against, let's say, the local elite. People don't see them, because when the Chinese come and then they take over, they give money. There is even a saying that the Chinese, even if you can go and Google, big man Ghana, big involved, you finish them. And big involved means that they'll staff money and then give. The bribing is so much, and Chinese don't have scums, I'm not talking about the average Chinese. I'm talking about those who are into businesses in Ghana. They just bribe their way through. And of course, the blame too should be Ghanaians who take those bribes and allow them to do. There should have been agreements, and some of us are arguing that there should be state-to-state agreement, like in Sanjay. Some of us are arguing that we should negotiate, if the state has allowed negotiation, we should negotiate with Sanjay company and say, this mines is ours. You are affecting water bodies. So let's keep 50% of the profits, and you take 50%, because after all, you are bringing the machines. But that is not the case. What happens is they come, they bribe the middle, the elites, and then they don't even pay. Last time when I was, they were owing quite a lot of our money, in almost $1 million or more than $1 million, even in taxes. They don't pay the taxes because they bribe our local elites and all others. So this is creating a lot of problems, for Chinese. But again, my question is, do the Communist Party have some kind of internationalism? Do they recognize? Because in Ghana, I don't see anybody, unlike Venezuela, Cuba, have some kind of relationship with sections of the Ghanaian left movement, talking to them, and they organize activity. But you never, the Chinese state is not interested. Chinese companies come in. When they come in, they just go for the top. And this middle elites, African elites, are so corrupt. They just go and bribe their way through, and as a result, the Western countries that were in control of these resources are very unhappy. So they are also helping to generate an anti-Chinese feeling across, at least in Ghana, that I know about. And I'm sure that in other African countries it is happening. We even hear there are things that they have taken over the Zambian airways or whatever, things like that. So I think that, I don't know, Heiko, do you know, is there any element of internationalism in the Communist Party at all?
Yeah, it's essentially the same. In a way, the question that Mansour asked earlier was the same issue. Is there any internationalism in the Communist Party? Well, to be frank, no. I mean, it's operating according, typically Stalinist fashion. It's operating according to its internal pressures. Having said that, I remember seeing a piece, I wrote a little article and I quoted Yanis Varoufakis. When the Greek crisis was happening, the Chinese came to them, to the Syriza government, offered them a deal, which he said was a fantastic deal. It guaranteed the rights of the workers, etc. So essentially it is, they will make a deal with anybody, whether it be the most brutal dictatorship or the most democratic so-called socialist, I mean, like Venezuela under Chavez, they were trying to make deals with them and they gave a lot of money. And so they'll just make deals. You know, their mandate is to make deals. And the deals, you know, there'll be some arrangement about how that is to benefit China. If it's a state-to-state deal, if it's not a state-to-state deal, or it's a state entity that's sort of under the radar and able to do what it likes, they will do exactly what you said. There's a guy here I know, I haven't seen him for a while, but anyway, he's a finance director of one of the largest companies in China, Sinochem. And he told me, this is a few years back, but basically the principle was that just before Xi Jinping came to power, the pressure will be even more so now. He said, nobody wants to become the manager of a major company at the moment, he said, because there's a double danger. On the one side, you will be charged with making deals here and there and encouraged to make deals here and there. On the other side, someone will come to you and they will put a briefcase on the table. The briefcase will be full of US dollars, and then they'll open it up and say, let's do this. And so the temptation, because you're in a room privately with someone, the temptation to take the money is overwhelming. On the other side, the danger of getting caught and arrested and denounced and put in prison and so on is also extremely high, even higher now since Xi Jinping ran his campaign, very, very high. Of course, the further you are away from Beijing, the easier it is. And of course, many of those people who are making the decisions in these places set themselves up in one way or another with a foreign passport or marry someone abroad or something like that in order to try and anchor themselves external to China. So about 60% of the wealthiest people in China are planning to leave China or have already got themselves a base somewhere else. If you look in New Zealand or in Canada or in the United States or elsewhere, there are masses and masses of wealthy Chinese who've managed to first they plant themselves there, get some security so they can run away if they need to. The second thing is, if they can, they keep up some relation inside China. A little more difficult more recently, but in any case, that's the basic dynamic. So yes, the local elites will make deals with Chinese businessmen who may be from the state or entities close to the state, and they will be perfectly happy to be corrupt and to manipulate things. That still doesn't detract from the idea of the overall capacity of the Chinese state, which could be emulated by governments which come to power as a result of revolution in one way or another, or a coup d'etat in, you know, proletarian Bonapartism, as we used to call it. I think that could still happen. And those regimes would also be of a very similar character, open to corruption, internal, you know. The interesting thing, however, is the way in which, despite this very pervasive corruption and internal mechanisms that promote such corruption, still they've been able to materially develop the economy faster than any capitalist country, any major capitalist country in world history. And so that's, if you like, illustrative that despite this capacity for corrupt operations, that the structural foundation of the system has facilitated rapid economic growth, you know, public ownership and so on, gaining resources from the private sector and investing them for development programs. So in general, no, they have no internationalism, not a bone of it in their, or not an ounce of it in their bones. And there lies perhaps the danger. I mean, this is speculative again, but there lies perhaps the danger for the development of capitalism in China if if an extreme nationalist movement comes to power as a consequence of conflicts with the rest of the world. I was going to touch upon Xinjiang because that kind of is an interesting illustration of their approach. The repression of Islam, or better said, more radical Islam in Xinjiang, is not really because of Islam. It's primarily because the urbanization process. This is a central hub on the route to Europe, and there's a limited number of people in these big cities. And so if they modernize them, in inverted commas, just the same as the peasants move into the cities, if you like, taught modern manners and modern culture, urban behavior and all this sort of thing, as a consequence both of policy and of the organization of their lives by the state, provision of large-scale housing blocks, training, education, modern workplaces. This is the intention in Xinjiang. That's why they had these camps, to train the people in this, the norms and mores of the rest of the mainland, of the Han Chinese urbanizing from the countryside. Well, their approaches do the same to the people in Xinjiang, to the Muslims there, and also, of course, try and de-radicalize them. But essentially, they think that if they're entering the modern world, if they use computers, the internet, if they are working in modern industry, if they're trained up to be doctors, engineers, scientists, and so on, at a very rapid rate, corresponding with the development plans for that area of China, then their theory is they will neutralize the danger of Islamic fundamentalism and integrate these people within the Chinese state. Whether that works or not is another question. All these type of, if you like, forced means of getting rid of religion have always been very, very dangerous pathways to take. And it's the same with Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong, the new law basically seeks to gain control over Hong Kong because they think they might lose the elections in September, and they hope that they would be able to convince people in Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong is a different historical tradition. They're not raising them up. In fact, the Hong Kong population have had a worsening of the living standards. So there's a kind of a unique situation there. But the principle is the same. It's always seen from a bureaucratic viewpoint. How do we achieve our objective to integrate these people of that part of the world, of that part of China, into the overall planning system and governmental structure of China by some bureaucratic measure, but also that will improve the living standards of the people. That's their approach.
Just just a quick question before I ask other comrades to. Do you think Cuba is trying to starting to copy some of the the approach of China to its economy? Just don't need to answer it now, but just later on. So other comrades who'd like to raise questions or comment, fire away. Roy, yeah, go for it, man.
Yeah, just a question, really. Thank you, Heiko. I thought that was a really good explanation of how the bureaucracy works in China, the dynamics of it all. I just was interested in to know sort of how the dynamics work between the party and the people, and are you saying the party and the bureaucracy are one and the same thing? And how do people express themselves in the factories? Do they have a say? Do they strike a great deal? I know it's faux democracy in Britain, but that they can elect local representatives and MPs and stuff. How do the people fit into this the triangulation, if you like?
Thanks, Troy. Heiko, if I can now get a couple more comments to come in and then
didn't answer yours actually, but anyway, go on.
Yeah, no. Jonathan is next, and then Demos. Go for it, Jonathan.
Sorry that I was late to the beginning of the meeting. I'll have to catch up on the recorded version of Heiko's lead off. I just want to pick up on a comment which Pat made about the connection to new economic policy. I think it's important to remember that in the 1920s there was a large contingent of Chinese students in the Soviet Union. And they certainly listened to, even if they didn't participate in the Soviet industrialization debate. The key element in that debate was on the question of the extent of the market economy. But there was general unity, both between Preobrazhensky and Bukharin, that in a transitional economy, the law of value would still continue to function. The discussion was really about how limited it should be, but there was no doubt in what both argued is that the law of value should continue to exist. And this really fundamental idea, which of course it was abandoned completely by Stalin, was taken back to China, and with Chinese economists who debated this question continuously with certain interruptions for the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. One of the main representatives was a guy called Sun Yefang, and politically it was one of the top bureaucrats, Shen Yan, who stood behind this idea. And they argued that the Soviet model under Stalin would not work, at least not in China, because the law of value had to continue to work. And it was in the late 70s, after the disaster of the Cultural Revolution and the havoc which it wreaked, both on the economy and the Communist Party itself, which was in a complete state of disarray by the late 70s. And these ideas then became predominant. So I think there's a kind of ideological direct link, actually, between the discussions around the new economic policy and the Soviet industrialization debate, and the discussion among Chinese economists. This Sun Yefang, the kind of Chinese equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Economics, is named after him because he, after spending 7 years in jail during the Cultural Revolution, but still maintaining his ideas, became a kind of big hero after that. And I think this is the discussion among Chinese economists, Marxists, they call themselves Marxist economists, and they take up these fundamental concepts that is practically unknown among the left in the West. The consistency in which Chinese economists oppose the Stalinist form of planning. Anyway, and just one more point, and that is a question on China's strength or the role of China in the world economy. Well, of course it's not dominant, but if you compare it to the United States, China is the main trading partner for all countries in Africa except the Central African Republic and Zimbabwe, where the US is the main trading partner. It's the main trading partner for all countries in Asia, for all countries in Latin America except Colombia, Ecuador, and Guyana. And in Europe, it's the main it's a bigger trading partner, not the main because the intra-European trade, but bigger than the United States in all countries except France, the UK, and Ireland. In North America, of course, the US, Mexico, Canada, the US is dominant. So it's certainly got a stronger position in terms of international trade than the United States has. In terms of foreign direct investment, of course, the United States still has a far larger position, although for many years now, the amount of foreign direct investment in Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States has been far larger than US foreign direct investment in China and in many other countries too. But in terms of the stock of accumulated foreign direct investment, of course, the US is still superior.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you again. That's brilliant. Maybe we take Themos has his hand up there. Go for it, Themos.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Heiko for an extremely clear and informative introduction. And I think I got to know much more about China from this hour or so than for many years before that. Nevertheless, I would like some more discussion on the question of the relationship between China and the world developments. Because whatever happened in the previous years, it was based on a fairly stable world. But we are living now through extreme instability. We are living through a period when China is being targeted by the United States, and not only the United States, but various other capitalist countries. And it seems to me that a lot of changes will result from this. I mean, if we see the behavior of the West towards Huawei, for example, I don't think we can look forward to a smooth development of Chinese world trade, as we have seen in the past. And although this is going to damage the West as well, I mean, they seem determined to make China contract and and stop having it there as an example of a different sort of development than the normal capitalist development. So I would like some comment on that. And I mean, we can see how they are trying to target China for the COVID-19 situation. I mean, they are already poisoning world opinion by making China responsible for the outbreak, and they are even discussing about possible reparations by China for the sad state of their economies. So I think this is important, and it's important in another sense as well. I have heard many people, not people from this gathering here, but many on the left have been discussing, well, China has such a great working class developing. It's the largest working class that has ever been in the world. That demands about democracy are bound to lead to changes there, and if China democratizes through workers' action, then we might have some sort of what we used to call political revolution. I'm a bit scared of this sort of discussion, because whatever happens, if in today's world, it's not a question of socialism in one country. It cannot be done. And we have all this world situation to take care of. And I wouldn't think that China is going to play a positive role in the sense of a positive revolutionary role as it develops. It's in the West that the game will be won or lost. The changes there are taking place so fast that it's a virtual world developing. I mean, everybody is increasing their military involvement in many places. So I would probably see China as much more stable internally than the world in general, and that's the sort of thing I think we should be discussing as well.
Thanks, Samos. Okay, just before I ask Heiko to sum up, there's been a bit of a discussion in the chat about terminology for China, and there's one comrade yesterday asked the question: how would we describe China's economy? A planned economy, state capitalism, or market socialism? And Altaf has been coming in that debate as well, with Joe Lin giving us some very interesting responses. So Heiko, perhaps you can, in your summing up, you could also take up the question of how would you describe the Chinese society economy? Okay, and so you've got about just nearly 20 minutes to round up. Okay.
Okay. I don't fully agree about the idea that the Chinese acquired this from the Soviet Union, at least from the left opposition side. I think they sided with the Bukharin theory. And Bukharin's theory was allow the law of value, in other words, the market, to develop with public ownership of the commanding heights and a dictatorship by the party. The dictatorship by the party will guarantee that the public ownership was maintained. So that's the essence, if you like, of Bukharin's theory. But he believed that the market was the driving force within the economy, and that you could allow, as you know, this. He had the theory of, developing at a snail's pace, or and allowing the private sector to develop almost unhindered, except for the power of the party and state to reimpose control. Preobrazhensky's view was that law of value needed to be contained and controlled, and that the original socialist accumulation was the law governing development in that country. So not market socialism, not the free reign of the market within the socialist economy, which could be, for example, the theoretical model for that was developed by a guy called Oskar Lange. He was he later became a minister in the Polish government. But in the 1920s, there was a debate between Hayek, the champion of classical or modern neoliberal theories, and Oskar Lange. And Oskar Lange said, well, within a modern society, because you have, under capitalism, large-scale entities that are removed from the direct control of the profit motive. So you have a large bureaucracy, for example, within General Motors or whatever, which actually implement the policies of the organization. And so there's a sort of bureaucratic entity similar to what exists inside a planned economy. And therefore, all you need to do is, if you had a completely publicly owned economy, you could adjust pricing according to impulses from the market. So he developed the theory of market socialism as a counterpole to the theory that prices and markets must control, that prices must control everything. He believed that prices could be adjusted by a publicly owned operation, and that it wouldn't be much different to a private sector operation. So, that was the theory, that was the origin of the theory of market socialism. Now, Preobrazhensky differed from that in the sense that he said that the driving force is the accumulation process towards the state, but it might have to meander different ways depending upon the specifics of the class struggle and the international relations at the time. So that's the framework I'd say. I think there's an interesting sideline to this, which is the Chinese did have a debate after 1989 that lasted for, well, until 2000 inside the Communist Party. They had a debate about what the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was. And they rejected the idea that it was Gorbachev or Western agents. And they put forward this idea that basically the Soviet Union had gone wrong in the 50s. And it had gone wrong in the 50s when Stalin was removed. The policies advocated by Khrushchev were actually the correct policies. They could have developed some type of new economic policy or some type of economic system similar to what exists in China today, had they adopted these methods that Khrushchev was proposing or had introduced to some degree at the time. So permitting small-scale private enterprises and so on, they could have developed the economy. But that still wasn't really in accordance with Preobrazhensky's theory, which was still in correspondence with the ideas of Trotsky, world revolution, and so on. Trotsky's theory in the new economic policy was that there would be a counter-revolution, or that the left opposition would take over and the workers, or better said, the workers would take over and the left opposition would be their representative. But the counter-revolution never came. Instead, the counter-revolution was this, what Trotsky later described as the bureaucratic counter-revolution, because he believed that had a very limited duration to it. So it's quite clear from experience of decades and decades since 1940 that Trotsky was wrong on that. It was possible to develop the economy under a bureaucratic control. And as we've discovered by investigating what's happened in China, or better said, as China has proven, you can do so even for a very long period of time, and perhaps, up until the day of the world revolution, if such a thing comes. One of the methods that were developed by bureaucratic thinkers trying to overcome the limitations of the planning system in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was to develop what they call computer models. So they thought you could overcome the limitations of the information deficit in the planned economies by introducing modern computers and using them as the mechanism for coordination. So instead of writing down lots of little pieces of paper and tables, what everybody's inputs and outputs were, you would work that out on a giant mathematical model, which would, if you like, guide the economy more efficiently. The problem was, of course, each of these things caused their own conflicts because the bureaucrats didn't want the information to be too detailed and so on. And the Chinese, if you like, have created some type of balance between private and state sector. And also in modern computing, the fact that they've been able to introduce perhaps, in terms of scale, an internet system superior to anybody else at a very rapid time, whilst maintaining a planned economy, is an astounding fact in and of itself. And it sort of combines together all these elements, elements of utilizing the market. Market can discipline the state sector, and Preobrazhensky said that as well. If you have private market entities that are functioning on the usual dynamism of a private economy, the individual motivation and the fact that an individual entrepreneur will work more than anybody, than a normal worker will work. They'll exploit themselves in order to achieve things and so on. These motivations can be used to facilitate, they develop a new application, for example, Alibaba develops a new application. Well, that can facilitate the development of state-owned entities that can emulate what those companies have done. And the whole program of joint ventures in China has been based on that type of thing. So if you invest, for example, if you're a car company in China, you invest in China, 50% of that company must be state-owned, or there must be a state-owned subsidiary which owns 50% of the operations. So they can learn everything, accumulate everything, even if they themselves are initially operating at a loss in their sector. Because later the development of, or the use of the knowledge which they accumulate from Volkswagen, for example, can be applied to develop Chinese cars. And that was certainly the case since about 2000. I remember looking at the car industry in 2003 or 2004, and the car industry was chaotic and hopeless in China, but all that was changed by the use of joint ventures and the, if you like, concentration of a few major factories rather than 80, 90 different factories producing these cars, which they had in China at that time. Roy mentioned about the party and the people. What's the relation with party and people? Well, about how many members is it now? Something like 90 million members. So it's a big section of the population. Party officials at the upper level, let's say the top 500,000 people, are the ones who are most likely to have resources at the disposal and to be able to accumulate. The lower levels of the party are much closer to the ordinary people. And in order to advance in the party, you have to carry out a lot of tasks. One of the reasons why they've invited these private sector people in is so they can keep a proper eye on what they're doing and give them tasks and responsibilities and rope them in to the control of the party, which itself then controls the bureaucracy. Not everyone in the bureaucracy is in the party, but the upper levels of the bureaucracy are controlled by party members. So the bureaucracy becomes an agency of the party, if you like. Central and local relationship is important because, for example, if there's a strike in a local area or there's a whistleblower in Wuhan, then you remove the local officials and the central state still looks good. And that's a general law in China. In the last 30 years, local state can take a hit and the central state will then impose its control. So that's a general law. And there is some significant degree of autonomy, both in the villages, towns, and provinces about what happens in those areas. And that's why you have these huge differences between, for example, Shenzhen, which is sort of very close, has been closely integrated with the world, Silicon Valley and all this sort of thing. And on the other side, Shenyang, which is quite an old school, old industries and so on, primarily based on the state, or Chongqing, where Bolshevik came to power and was challenging the leadership. They were still 60% state enterprises, nearly all, motorbike production and, major industrial enterprises, old school enterprises of the state system, but modernized as a result of the influx of foreign capital, which allowed them to develop modern technologies and produce things nearly at the level or surpassing the level of the West. The reason I mentioned about not being market socialism is because basic elements within the economy distort the economy out of the pricing, the market pricing system. So, for example, if capital is provided by the state at low levels of interest, but to the private sector is provided at high levels of interest, then it's not a market economy in that sense. I mean, you distorted the market to favor the state sector and to maintain its dominance. And they've always, whenever any problems emerge in that front, they always assert the state's dominance over those sectors of the economy. I mean, the Americans control, I know you didn't really want to talk about this, but Themos has raised some of these questions. The Americans control the world market through their navy and through their military bases around the world, the military influence around the world. And that way they control world trade. And of course, Belt and Road is a direct challenge to that. Belt and Road is a plan to link together 60% of the world's population by road, rail, and shipping networks that bypass, if you like, the American control. So that's, of course, the parameters or the battleground between. That's why Belt and Road it's a throwing down the gauntlet to the West, if you like. We will establish a global marketplace organized around our own infrastructure. And so that's the challenge, if you like, to the Americans. And, and all the conflicts that are emerging around this are rooted in that conflict about world trade. The Chinese know very well that the Americans will try to stifle them and control them. And that's why all the Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea and all this. I think that's covered most of those things. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Heiko, great. Good session. I hope everyone agrees.
Yeah.
But still, a lot more to discuss and study.
Sure.
And as I say, we're going to have another session quite a way. It's going to be one of the last sessions in the series, which will be on the future of China and looking at ways that the problems that China has and its limitations. For example, what Yen raised, for example, and its lack of an international policy.
So one more thing I should mention.
Sure, Heiko, yeah.
Just connected with what Roy was saying. The general pattern of conflicts in China is to use the law against the powers that be. So one example of that is the law in China, although not practiced, says all work, for example, in Shanghai, all workplaces, private, public, foreign, are managed by what's called the Staff and Workers Representative Council. That's the official line. So the managers are elected, and the plans that they propose must be presented to the workforce and accepted by the workforce. Now, in most cases, that is the case, is that or better said, it's the case that the upper level imposes the Staff and Workers Representative Council, picks a few people who are loyalists, and then it's a formality. So formally, workers' democracy exists. In practice, it's a bureaucratic imposition. But there are examples, minority examples, obviously it is a dictatorship, but there are examples where in conflict, the workers bring that institution to life. So they remove a manager, perhaps they kidnap them, perhaps they beat them, perhaps they hold a meeting, call a strike, call a demonstration, block the road, whatever, and then demand that the Workers' Representative Council become the official body controlling the workplace. For example, in the Honda strike in 2010, that's what happened. They created a Workers' Representative Council elected by the workers, which then settled the dispute. But then once the dispute was settled, then they began to move against some of the people who were causing trouble and sort of regained their authority over this. So these Workers' Representative Councils are a mechanism, it's a recognition by the Chinese party that the danger towards workers' democracy in our conceptual framework exists. And the way to stop it is to create the legislative framework that says it exists and to control it and to keep it under control. And then when it does actually emerge, well, okay, you've got workers' democracy, but they'll keep it inside a workplace. So there are some workplaces where the factory management is elected by the workers. And it actually, some of them are sort of are tourist attractions. There's one beer making factory, for example, in China that operates according to supposed workers' democratic principles. But it's an anachronism at that particular one. But there are other cases, like I said, where workers have used these institutions to seize control or to gain control over their lives. But this is obviously because we're dealing with a nation of 1.4 billion. The scale at which it would have to operate to realize it on a national scale would just have, it would be a gigantic revolutionary upheaval.
Thanks, that's a good addition. Okay, there's a saying that towards the second to last thing in our series will be on the future of China and perhaps what changes could be made to it, which is what Heiko just contributed on is would be good for that. Now, the only thing we've got to decide now, I think, is the date of our next meeting. Now, Jonathan has agreed to speak on planning on the Wednesday, let's see where we are now. On the 10th today, and I think it's the 1st of July. Is that 3 weeks from now? It's the 1st of July. My calculation is correct. Yeah? Okay. Jonathan said he's happy to speak on democratic public planning. So that'll be a very fascinating subject. Everybody happy with that? Any problems? Same time?
Okay.
Same place, of course, online.
Yeah, that's great.
What choice have we got? I mean, one of the interesting things, by the way, this whole online, it's kind of like this coronavirus has led to a bit of an online meetings revolution. And one of the strange things out of that is I think that it opens up the potential for international organization on the left, on the socialist movement. It opens up a lot of possibilities. I think we want to take advantage of that in the coming years. All right, comrades, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed it. And see you in 3 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heiko. Thanks, Heiko. Brilliant. Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks, Heiko.
Ta-da.
Heiko.